I should introduce myself. I'm Catherine Tong. I am the team lead for the Inspire Teaching pillar for the program for faculty development. I'm a physician in emergency medicine and family medicine. So I want to welcome everybody to our session today. Thank you for coming. I see Sandra, Vanessa, Ryan, Manuela, and Sean. And Joan here is actually my partner in crime for our first presentation. Actually, Joan is going to do the heavy lifting on this presentation for the next 15 minutes about trauma-informed medical education. So I will give you the floor, Joan.
Thanks, Catherine. Hello, everybody. I'm Joan Chan. I'm a family physician who trained at McMaster for my medical undergrad and my residency. And I now practice in Guelph, and that's like I'm literally here in my clinic. And I'm also an adjunct professor for family medicine residents at the McMaster University KW campus. And what I teach there is the mental health and behavioral science curriculum. So that's the curriculum. Instead of a psychiatry rotation, family medicine residents do case-based learning where they learn about not only how to treat mental health conditions, but also considering themselves as a piece of what happens between them and a patient. And that's the piece that I'm most interested in. And that's sort of my general passion, is what gets in the way of having a healthy, sustainable relationship between ourselves as healthcare providers and the field of healthcare. I think a lot of people are feeling pretty burnt out, especially right now, but in general, healthcare is a field that has pretty high rates of burnout. And there's a lot that gets in the way of our ability to enjoy our jobs, even though we often go into it, with deep passion and desire to help and care for people. And so I'm interested in what gets in the way. And so that leads to what I want to talk about today, which is the impacts of trauma. I have discovered that it's a very useful frame to think of the impacts and fallout of trauma as one of the most prevalent pain points between that's breaking our relationship with our work, and also is breaking the relationship we may have between ourselves as educators and our learners. And so it's been interesting to learn that there's a whole field called trauma-informed education, and considering how the impacts of trauma could be playing a role in challenges that you're having as educators with your learners, as well as challenges you're having personally with your clients or patients. So just so you know, my notes are slightly above, so that's why I keep looking up if you're wondering where my eyes are going. One thing I want to say up front is that talking about trauma can be hard. It usually brings up our own trauma experiences, and that means a lot of thoughts buzzing in our brain, a lot of emotions zipping through our bodies that can feel very uncomfortable. And so I want to tell you up front that everything I'm going to share with you in this next 15 minutes is an invitation. It's an offering. Nothing here is mandatory or a new standard you have to beat yourself up to consider if you're doing it right or not. It's all meant as an optional frame that hopefully will help you and in service of your own growth and learning and strengthening your skills as an educator, as well as a healthcare professional. So if you are noticing it's hard to focus, if you're finding you have a lot of strong emotions or a lot of noisy thoughts in your brain, that might mean that you're being a bit activated as you listen to what I'm going to describe. Just some practical ways to help you address these is, first of all, you can always, I don't mind if your camera's on or off, that it's totally up to you. So whatever helps you feel safe and secure, I'm good with either. One thing that helps a lot, especially if you're feeling a lot of away, is looking away from the screen and just looking around you and realizing that you are likely alone in a room, safe, with no one around you. You're just looking at some pixels at a screen. Taking those deep breaths where you breathe in for maybe 4 counts and out for 8. So making sure that exhale is nice and long. It can be helpful, especially if you're feeling extra stressed, to hold your face or hold your neck, even just reach back a bit. It's a very calming, soothing gesture you can do to your body. Or sometimes even if you're feeling really amped up or agitated, squeezing your muscles, or even, off camera or on, feel free, running on the spot, shaking yourself down. So, and if it's really like, wow, this is really hitting me in a way I didn't think, I will be offended if you turn off your camera or if you leave. Like, I just want you to know that this presentation of itself, I'm designing to be trauma informed, which means you are an active participant and you get to set the pace in which you want to learn. Just saying, I'm not planning on trying to activate your trauma. It's not like I'm about to show you a bunch of horror or anything, in case that came off, but just to say all of this learning and these memories can bring things up, and it's important to acknowledge that. So I just want to give you my working definition of trauma. I mean, this is a huge field. There's lots of ways of describing it, but the way I describe it for myself and for my patients or learners is mental and emotional conditioning that's shaped by painful past events. That's how I like to think of it, especially that conditioning word really helps me. If you think of like Pavlov's dog and ring a bell and you salivate, like it's like almost you don't have time, you just suddenly are like, whoa, why is this coming off so strongly? Like, what is going on in my head and my body right now, right? We usually think of trauma as something that's the fallout of one major horrific event. So someone like witnessed a significant act of violence or had an act of violence, perpetrated on them, or they were in war, something like very big according to our society. A lot of trauma researchers and educators call that big T trauma. So those are the things we often think of. When we think of trauma-informed medical care, for example, we think of people who have experienced maybe sexual violence or things like that. But really it goes beyond that. There's also something called small T trauma, which are smaller as in not major life-altering events, but small, but often consistent over time, over many contexts that delivered a message to you that left you feeling unsafe, that left you feeling like your ability to create safety for yourself is now impaired. So, and that's, I would say, one that is more frequent, though of course, especially for us in healthcare, we can really, even in our medical education, witness things that are quite graphic or quite traumatic and emotionally distressing, right? So we can have a combination of big T and small T trauma that are now living in our bodies, and our learners as well could be having that going on as well. And so when we feel the impacts of trauma, we feel that in our minds, it impairs or changes our cognitive abilities, and in our bodies, it changes our physiological state if we have these conditionings that come through and have things that remind us about them. And I'll just say that the society we live in hasn't really set us up to not have small T traumas. I would actually posit that a lot of the strong societal messages that we've learned, especially those that are creating division and oppression from one group to another, are a kind of, I don't even want to know, small T, big T, some combo. So for example, being raised in a patriarchal society impacts in a significant way people raised female with different stories than those that raise male, never mind if someone's actually gender non-conforming or not a non-binary gender individual, right? Being raised in white supremacy impacts people raised white differently than those raised in a racialized identity. And I know that's the talk happening a bit later, but that's something we're learning more about, like race-based trauma. It significantly shows up for ourselves as educators, our learners, as well as our clients and patients, right? So why does this matter to us as educators? Everyone who's listening and everyone that you teach is a human with a human brain and a human body. So that is why it applies, because we're literally all swimming in it. Unless someone here like teaches animals, in which I want to hear more about that. Our human brains learn best from a place of safety and security. So I heard this really great talk, and I'm happy to share the link, that talks about learning brain versus survival brain. So when you are in an activated, like trauma activated state, that's your survival brain. Versus if you are in a calmer, secure place of belonging, that is where you actually do your learning. And so say you have learners or yourself in a state that really triggers a trauma experience or trauma conditioning, it's really hard to learn. And so that is our whole goal as educators, is to help foster environments where our learners can actually learn the material, right? So we do have the capacity to build these learning spaces, first and foremost, by addressing and creating safety and security for our own brains and bodies, internally, as well as, setting boundaries or setting up our own spaces to acknowledge that. And it's from that place that then we can move forward and also extend that safety and security to our learners. And I would just posit that that is actually going to be the most efficient and effective way of teaching. And a lot of the things that we think we need to do in order to be a good teacher can get in the way of that. So now I just want to tell you a story about a time when I was a medical student and reflecting back on some of the things that showed up being trauma conditioning that came up for me. So as I said, I'm a physician, so I was in medical school and I had a preceptor who did surgical assists. So they weren't the primary surgeon, but they helped with surgeries. And to date on this rotation, I had gotten the impression from my preceptor that he thought I was a weak learner. He almost pretty much said it to me, like the very first patient I saw in his clinic setting, I took a long time with, and after he was like, wow, you took so long in there. I was like, where did she go? Like, does she know anything? And my last student was so fast and so helpful. And I was just like, whoa, like what took you so long? And as a lifelong high achiever people pleaser, that was activating for me. And so now I was spending most of the rest of my rotation trying to please him and get him to like me and perform well for him. So any learning brain that I might have had at the beginning of the rotation was off. I was fully in survival brain, which for me and for many people, especially getting into medicine and other forms of healthcare, was about performance, about trying to create that safety by getting his approval and getting him to like me, right? Those are trauma responses. And so I was in this setting in an OR and I'd never inserted a catheter before, like a urinary catheter. And he asked me if I wanted to do it. And I had to say yes, according to my trauma conditioning as a people pleasing, raised female, etc. person, because I wanted to impress him. But I didn't know all the steps. And so when I tried to put it in and he said, do you think it's in? I was like, yes. And so then what happened is, if you don't know, if you don't insert the catheter in far enough, there's a prostate in the way, and then you inflate a balloon. And so I accidentally helped this person's enlarged prostate become smaller. It was not good. And the urologist just came in and said that I might have wrecked his urethra forever. Like it was a really horrible encounter. I felt deep shame and anxiety. I thought it was my fault. I thought I was just like a weak learner. And then later I got really mad at the preceptor because I think there were some factors that he could have helped to set up a safe container in which I could say, I'm not sure what I'm doing. Could you show me some steps? Could you show one to me first? And none of those were there. So you can see how I would posit he did not have trauma-informed education at the front of his fort. And the thing I will say even beyond that is, it's easy to then sort of put the blame exclusively on him, but really I found it the most healing to just witness the stories that were running through both of us about what a teacher's supposed to do and what a student's supposed to do. And those are deeply rooted in a bunch of oppressive fashions about, hierarchy and, the need to perform that don't end up they get in the way of actual learning, right? So, yeah. So I'm curious, like even just for yourself to reflect on how you feel even listening to that story, or if you can relate to the story. For me, two trauma responses or emotional conditioning responses that came up in that story was my people pleasing. So my desire for him to have a happy feeling towards me and need to perform in order to get his approval, and the validation seeking is a piece of that too. So, I mean, literally the way our system's often set up is we need to get a good eval. And so much of what we do instead of learning is learning what we need to learn to get a good eval. I would just posit that is harmful and not trauma informed, and rooted in some stuff that we need to kind of unpack as society, much less our little corner of medical education. I also posit as healthcare providers, sometimes we feel a bit of a need to stay stable and stuck in tradition, but really we care for humans' bodies and we have human bodies. We have the secret knowledge. That means we can be at the forefront of considering the impact of trauma on ourselves and our learners in a powerful way, right? So I know we only have a couple minutes left. So just to say, what can we do next? So say you've listened, you go, okay, I understand a bit of what she's saying, but what do I even go from there? This seems overwhelming. Now do I have to tell each of my learners, what's your trauma? Like, we get sort of like, I don't want to trigger someone, etc. But really my invitation as in this intro talk is consider where it shows up in your life. And maybe you have big T trauma, or maybe you have small T trauma. I think we all are swimming in an oppressive society that's at least offered us small T trauma where we haven't been fully safe and secure in each environment we've lived in. And so my invitation is to explore that for yourself and explore where that's shown up. And sometimes that involves trauma therapy. And I just think that is wonderful and an excellent professional development skill if you need it, but also, you know, other resources. I'm also gonna, there's that video I sent, but also there's a book I recently read that talks about some powerful body brain practices and the role of your body and brain in things like trauma, by a Canadian psychologist that I found very readable and accessible, one of many, many sources. And that's all I actually want to discuss today. I wanted to just sort of open up this idea as, and I guess the last thing I'd say is with this frame, there's no such thing as a weak learner or a weak teacher. It's people who maybe have unresolved challenges that are leading to behaviors that aren't conducive to their learning. And so instead of punishment or that sort of thing, like what would happen if we really leaned into supporting, identifying what's in the way, which I know is the way that we're going, but I think naming it more explicitly of what's happening versus weakness or behaviors, I think it's more genuine and I think it will be more effective. So Sandra, I know you had your hand up. Did you want to say something?
Well, first, I just want to say a huge thank you because I really appreciated your honesty and sharing your experience. And it resonates with me both as a teacher and also in the face of our learners. And I've thought about this so much, is how can I cultivate a sense within my classroom that you are enough. You don't need to be so focused on highest achievement. And I have so many things going through my head after having listened to your talk. But one thing I recently read about trauma-informed teaching, and I've been trying to implement it more recently, is this sense of enacting a comportment of unconditional positive regard towards our students. And that's, I believe, rooted in the work of Rogers. Not entirely sure, but it's not my idea. And it was based on a psychologist, and I could find out who it was. And I wondered, and so what I'm sort of experimenting with, that's a little e experimenting with, is the idea of, I wonder if the students can see that I regard them positively, irrespective of anything, if it might minimize some of this desire to please. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I love that so much. The way that it's put in the YouTube video that Catherine posted that I love is like the notion of elephants, which made me sound, but baby elephants play when they're surrounded by mama elephants. And that's when they learn, is through play, which is actually how we kind of all learn, even adults, right? So, so there's a certain design of their colony. And so what he says is, how as teachers can we be the mama elephants? So creating that circle of safety around our learners. And I'm really interested to go as far as we need to with it. I think a lot of times I hear it's like, well, then how do we know who's best? Or, you know, don't you have to give them an evaluation or a grade? And I've just seen, like, what if you said to your learners at the beginning of a course or whatever, like, I'm going to give you all a good eval. Like, I know it sounds like, oh, aren't some of them supposed to have a bad eval? But like, first of all, I mean, it depends what your program is, but like, is that true? Do we have to grade on a curve? Why? What is that rooted in, that we have to compare one to the other versus individually supporting their learning? So what happens if you say at the beginning of a course, like, hey, you made it to med school, physio school, like you've made it to the thing, so you've done the whatever. Now this is your chance to become the professional you've always wanted to be. So I'm gonna give you a good eval. That eval will contain some details about things I think you could strengthen, or, you know what I mean? Like, whatever. And if you want, I can deliver it to you in a way that it doesn't end up on your transcript. Like, I don't care about a transcript. Like, I mean, maybe there's certain purposes of a transcript, but I think we need to just really question, it's so deeply ingrained. Like my residents that I work with, they're like, oh, it would be nice to try practicing this skill or this skill, but I'm afraid of what my preceptor will say. They're afraid to try and fail. That's what learning is. And so like, how can we be like, fail, please, fail constantly. That means you're learning, because that's just what science says is how we learn in our brains, right? And I just think a lot of times when we get anxious, and I get anxious too, I'm like, oh, is this like countercultural to talk about? I'm aware that that's based on conditioning that, in my opinion, are forces that would rather I don't trust my own intuition and my own knowledge about science, and instead defer that sense of authority to others. Like, it's not the most empowering forces that make me worried about that kind of thing, you know? So it's a trauma response, right? So I know I've actually gone 5 minutes over. I'm not sure who's supposed to speak next, but I don't want to take over your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being vulnerable and opening this really important conversation. I think I have no doubt that it's going to resonate with a lot of people. And yeah, thank you so much. That was great.
You're welcome. Are you next, Vanessa?
So next we have implementing trauma and violence-informed pedagogical practices. So Sandra, I believe that's you.
Oh, perfect.